Salut and bonjour, everyone. My name is Jim Jagielski, and first and foremost, I want to send my thoughts and prayers to everyone in Paris, especially those directly affected by the tragic events over the weekend. And I apologize personally for not being able to attend the conference. However, I hope this short video presentation will make some amends for my inability to attend. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, I won't be able to address them interactively, but I do provide my contact information at the end. So please feel free to contact me with any feedback, questions, or comments. Thank you very much. A little bit about me. I am a co-founder of the Apache Software Foundation, and I assume most people know me by my association with the ASF. I'm also a director of numerous open source foundations out there, as well as ex-directors of some, such as OSI. I guess the biggest thing that I am a hacker, and so everything that I've come up with, my involvement in open source actually derives from a hacker background. And I am very, very happy that I've got an absolutely fantastic job as senior director in the Tech Fellows program with Capital One, which kind of actually makes this presentation a little bit about what's in your project. If you're familiar with Capital One, which is a US-based credit card services, their tagline is "What's in your wallet?" So I kind of thought this was kind of fun. What we'll be talking about today are actually licenses, governance, and community. First of all is the idea or the question of why do we need licenses? The main reason, of course, is that copyright is the default unless there is a specific and explicit license associated with a work, with a software project. It's assumed to be under copyright, which really restricts and limits what can be done with it as far as end users and redistribution and stuff like that. And so to ensure that something is open source means that you need to have an open source license associated with that. Now, the goals of any open source license, whether you call it open source or free software, is to ensure which parts remain open and free, and to maintain some level of control over the code and direction, as well as to build a community or a commercial marketplace around that software project itself. And of course, for most end users, this is their only interaction with the open source project itself, is the license, which controls, limits, restricts, and allows how they're able to use and redistribute the software out there. For software to be open source, as I said before, it must be under an OSI approved open source license. There are very, very many of them. At last count, over 60 of those exist. But really, when you think about it, there are actually three main types of open source licenses out there. As I mentioned before, especially in the European Union, open source is not, as a phrase used, the term free software is much more based in how people are looking at the software. Free software and open source are kind of like pretty much the exact same. There's sort of like two sides of the same coin. And so in a lot of spaces, you'll see it not called free software, open source, but actually false, free, libre, libre as in the freedom associated with that open source software. Now, of course, the OSI has a list of characteristics and criteria that require or define what an open source license should be. The Free Software Foundation actually has a list of 4 freedoms which must be maintained for something to be characterized as a free software language or a free software project. I kind of think we can actually make that even easier and distill that down to 3 promises that the license itself gives to the end users. To make this easier to understand, let's pretend that the source code, the program, are actually cookies. The actual kind of cookies that you eat, biscuits if you're English or from the UK. And so not only is it the actual cookies themselves, but the recipes that are part of how you create the cookie itself. So the first promise is the ability to actually use the software project itself. As you see, it's the promise that you can use the recipe to actually create the cookie, but also to eat the cookie as well. Now, there are a couple of implicit criteria in that with the ability to use. For example, you have to be able to read the recipe. You have to be able to understand the recipe to be able to use it to actually create the cookie. So, of course, access to the recipe itself is inherent in the idea of using the software. Also, you're able to use the cookie, use the software in the expected way that the original person created the software project. So with the case of a cookie, you're actually eating a cookie, but you can actually use it for other things as well. If, for example, you have a wobbly table and you want to put a cookie under one of the legs of the table to stabilize it, well, that's an acceptable use of it. So the definition of the word use is really up to the end user itself. And that is one of the promises associated with a free software and an open source license. Another promise is the ability to modify that cookie or to modify that software program. Again, using the cookie analogy, we can see that if you have a base cookie recipe, if you want to go and add chocolate chips or maybe make it a little bit more cake-like or a little bit more doughy-like, you're able to modify the actual recipe itself to have an end result of a cookie which is much more in tune with what you want and not necessarily restricted to what the original recipe defined. Not only that, but you can take the resulting cookie, assuming it's based on the original recipe, and actually modify it at the end of it. So in this situation right here, we see the characteristic of having a original cookie, but we're actually modifying the end result by putting some icing on top of it. That's another promise that open source and free software provides. And finally, the promise to be able to share the recipe, as well as any modifications to that recipe as well. One of the nice things about sharing software and programs is that unlike in the case of sharing a cookie, you're not left with less of a cookie. You can share it with as many people as possible, and it doesn't reduce your access to that. But the ability to share those modifications as well as the original content itself is crucial to the whole concept of open source and free software out there. Now, as I mentioned previously, there are three main types of open source licenses out there. The first main type is what I call the give me credit. These are the permissive licenses, such as the Apache V2 license, MIT, and BSD. And these are basically saying, we don't care what you do with the software itself. You just can't claim it's your original creation. You have to give us credit for the original thing that you received from us. One way to explain this is just imagine, again, using the cookie and recipe analogy, that you take a base cookie recipe and you modify it, the actual recipe itself, maybe adding some eggs, a little bit less sugar, maybe a different kind of flour. So you have the original recipe, your modifications to that recipe, and say you also have this family secret recipe for chocolate chips, and you want to add that into the cookie itself. So that's a modification. That's the derivative work of that recipe. Well, the Give Me Credit license, the permissive licenses, do not require you to give those modifications away. You can keep those modifications as family secrets, as something which is proprietary to yourself. You just need to make sure that anyone who has that new and improved cookie knows where to get the original recipe of it. So there's really no restrictions on or requirements for you to give any of that stuff back. Of course, in most cases, the hope and expectation are is that you will, but it's not a requirement of there. Now, the second type is what's called a weak copyleft. And of course, the Eclipse public license and the lesser GPL were great examples of this. And the idea behind this is basically you're just required to give the fixes back. Again, looking at that, that new and enhanced cookie that I just spoke about. If you're redistributing those cookies, you are required to give those changes to the actual original recipe back to the original recipe owner. So the way you've changed and modified that recipe needs to be given back, so that way the recipe can be maintained, improved, and those improvements to the base recipe can be shared with other people. But the addition of those chocolate chips can still stay as a family secret or a trade secret. You don't need to, because they're separate from the actual recipe itself and not a modification or an enhancement to the actual recipe. You just need to give the recipe changes back, and you're still able to keep the chocolate chip recipe as a long-term trade secret. And finally, we have the third type of license, which is the give me everything or the strong copyleft licenses. Now, these are the kind of requirements that basically say, because everything else is free, we require everything else to be free as well. So again, going with this cookie analogy, you are required to give not only the recipe improvements back to the community, but you would also be required to share your family secret chocolate chip recipe. That would actually need to be part of what's also provided to out there. So as you can see, that the GPL nature is kind of sticky. It's kind of like a little bumblebee that goes as it goes from flower to flower or entity inside of a software project. It actually gets combined with all the other things, and it sort of like pollinates all the other software components to also be GPL as well. There are also three main types of governance and community. First of all is the walled garden type, which are very, very self-controlled by usually a commercial entity. These are very, very restrictive as far as what patches are provided in. A central agency serves as the choke point for these kinds of patches and improvements. And in general, the entire open source community has very, very limited control over the direction and future of these software projects. The second main type is what's called the benevolent dictator for life. This is kind of like a walled garden in the very case that there's a single entity that controls where this goes. But in this situation, it's the community that assigns that power or authority to the entity. It's not assumed by the entity. The community provides that. And a great example of this, of course, is the Linux system itself, where Linus has basically total control over what goes into the Linux kernel. And the third main type is what's called meritocracy, in which it's really much a community-based effort. The community itself controls and defines the process, the future, the enhancements, the direction of an open source project. It really is government by the masses out there. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how you're able to build community. We like to use inside of the ASF mailing lists because they are asynchronous. They don't disenfranchise people from different time zones. So again, you may not need to use mailing lists, but just make sure that you're not requiring any sort of development process or methodology that requires people to be face-to-face in the same time zone or anything like that. You want to encourage involvement in activity from people no matter where they are. Another thing that's very, very important is to drive consensus. Make sure that the entire community is involved in the health and future of a project. By ensuring the health and viability of a community, you're also enjoying and ensuring the viability and long-term success of the project itself. And finally, avoid the concept of poisonous people who create a lot of friction inside the community. By doing so, you're really restricting and limiting the amount of diversity in the community. You're creating community in which new people, new talents, New ideas are not welcomed, and of course, that is the death knell for the continued support and viability of projects out there. So basically, the three main things when you're creating an open source project is to play nice, to share, and to have fun. Merci. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. Here's my contact information. If there are any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me. I wish everyone a great couple days with the conferences going on. Wish everyone health and happiness and your continued safety. And cheers. Bye-bye.